In a small town in Ghana, Joyce's story began in sadness. She was just a baby when she was left on the steps of an orphanage, with no one knowing who her parents were. The kind nuns who ran the place gave her a warm bed, meals, and clothes, but the orphanage wasn't like having a real home. It was filled with other children, but even with all the noise, Joyce often felt alone. She would watch the other kids play and laugh, but deep inside, she longed for something more, a family of her own. She wished for parents who would love her, care for her, and make her feel special. The orphanage wasn't a bad place, though. The nuns tried their best. They taught the children how to read and write, how to be polite, and they always had a smile for them. Still, every night Joyce would lie in bed and dream of the day when she would have parents. She didn't want to feel different anymore. When Joyce turned 14, things took a surprising turn. One afternoon, a couple named Amos and Ifua came to the orphanage. They had been married for 8 years but hadn't been able to have a child of their own. They looked at all the children, but their eyes rested on Joyce. She was shy, standing off to the side, but there was something about her that made Amos and Ifua's hearts soften. After talking with the nuns, they made a decision. They wanted to adopt Joyce. Joyce couldn't believe it when she heard the news. Her heart raced with excitement. Finally, she was going to have a family. The day she left the orphanage, she held tightly to Ifua's hand, her eyes shining with hope. "Thank you," she whispered. She felt like her life was finally going to be as wonderful as she had dreamed. At first, everything was perfect. Amos and Ifua were kind and caring. They bought Joyce new clothes, cooked her favorite meals, and even enrolled her in a new school. Joyce loved her new life. For a whole year, it felt like she had found the family she had always wanted. But one day, Ifua came home with big news. She was pregnant. Joyce was happy for them, clapping her hands with excitement. She didn't know, however, that this news would change everything. When Ifua gave birth to a healthy baby boy, all the love and attention shifted. The baby became the center of their world. Amos and Ifua doted on him, giving him the best clothes, toys, and food. They were always busy taking care of him, and slowly, they began to ignore Joyce. The smiles they once gave her were now reserved for their son. Joyce tried to be understanding. She did her chores, helped with the baby, and kept to herself. But things only got worse. Soon, Amos and Ifua began treating her differently. They started giving her more chores, like cleaning the house and washing clothes. "You're older now, Joyce. You need to help more," they would say. But Joyce could feel the change in their tone. It wasn't a request. It was an order. She was no longer the child they once cared for. She became more like a servant in the house. Every day, she scrubbed floors, cooked meals, and watched over their baby. She felt invisible, like a shadow in the corner of the room. The love she had once felt from them was gone, replaced by coldness and harsh words. One evening, as Joyce sat quietly in her small room, she could hear Amos and Ifua laughing and playing with their son in the living room. Tears filled her eyes. "Why don't they love me anymore?" she thought. She wiped her eyes and tried to be strong, but her heart was heavy. She missed the days when they would hug her, tell her stories, and make her feel like she belonged. Joyce didn't know what her future held, but she knew one thing. She would have to find her own way. Deep inside, she still held on to the hope that one day she would be loved again. Joyce's life in Amos and Ifua's house became worse with each passing year. The couple stopped Joyce from going to school, with the reason that they no longer have enough money to fund her education anymore. Joyce was no longer the happy, hopeful girl she once was. Instead, she became a servant in the very home where she had once been loved. Each morning, Joyce woke up before the sun to start her chores. She scrubbed the floors, washed clothes, and cooked meals for the family. No matter how hard she worked, it was never enough. "Why is the floor still dirty, Joyce?" Ifua would snap, her eyes filled with anger. Amos wasn't any kinder. He would look at her with disappointment whenever something wasn't done perfectly. "You should be thankful we even took you in," he would remind her often. Joyce was not allowed to play or rest like other children. When their son made a mess, it was Joyce who had to clean it up. If the baby cried at night, it was Joyce who had to wake up and rock him back to sleep. "Do your job right, Joyce," Ifua would say, handing her the crying child with no care for Joyce's tired eyes. Years passed, and the house became like a prison to her. Joyce had no friends, no one to talk to. The only time she felt a bit of freedom was when she did odd jobs around town to earn a little money. She would wash clothes for the neighbors or sweep their yards, just to escape the cruel words and long days of work at home. On one particularly hot afternoon, after spending hours in the sun cleaning the yard, Joyce accidentally knocked over a vase in the living room while mopping. The vase shattered into tiny pieces. Afua rushed into the room, her face twisted in anger. "How dare you break my vase?" she screamed, her voice echoing through the house. "Do you know how much that cost?" Amos joined in. "You're nothing but a burden to this house." His words hit Joyce like a stone. Tears filled her eyes as she bent down to pick up the broken pieces. Her hands shook, but she didn't say a word. She had learned long ago that speaking up would only make things worse. That night, as Joyce lay on the thin mattress in her small room, she knew she couldn't stay any longer. She was now 18, and her body and heart couldn't take the pain anymore. She had to escape. Quietly, she packed the few belongings she had, a faded dress, a pair of worn-out shoes, and the little money she had saved from her odd jobs. Her heart raced as she tiptoed through the house. She was scared that Amos or Afua might hear her, but the house was silent. With one last glance at the house that had brought her so much pain, she slipped out into the night. The streets were dark and quiet as Joyce walked away from the only home she had known. She didn't know where she was going, but she knew she couldn't look back. After hours of walking, the sun began to rise, and Joyce found herself standing at the edge of a bustling city. The streets were alive with the sound of people, cars, and sellers calling out to passers-by. The city was nothing like the small town she had grown up in. Everything felt big, loud, and overwhelming. For days, Joyce wandered the streets, trying to find work. She knocked on doors, asking if anyone needed help with cleaning or cooking, but everyone turned her away. "We don't need anyone," they would say before closing the door in her face. Joyce's small savings quickly disappeared, and soon she had nothing left. Hunger gnawed at her stomach as the days turned into weeks. She slept on the streets, her body tired and weak. Every night, she would wonder if she had made the right choice in leaving, but she knew she couldn't go back. Just when Joyce thought she couldn't go on any longer, she met a kind woman named Auntie Abba. Auntie Abba had noticed Joyce wandering the streets and offered her a small job cleaning her house. Joyce worked hard as always, and Auntie Abba was impressed with how well she cleaned and cooked. "Do you have anywhere to stay, my dear?" Auntie Abba asked one day, seeing how tired Joyce looked. "No, ma'am," Joyce replied quietly, her eyes downcast. Auntie Abba shook her head, feeling sorry for the young girl. "I know someone who might need a maid, a wealthy young man. He's looking for help. Would you like to work for him?" Joyce's heart leaped with hope. "Yes, ma'am, I would." Auntie Abba smiled warmly. "Good, I will talk to him for you. I think this could be the start of something better for you." Joyce thanked her, holding back tears of relief. Maybe, just maybe, things were about to change for the better. Eric, the wealthy young man, lived in one of the grandest mansions in the city, a place so big and full of riches that many would dream of living there. But Eric, despite all his wealth, was a lonely man. His heart had grown cold over the years as he surrounded himself with people who only wanted his money and influence. He trusted no one. When Auntie Abba recommended Joyce for the job, Eric barely glanced at her when she arrived. To him, she was just another worker, someone to clean and stay out of sight. But for Joyce, this was a new beginning. After all the pain and hardship, she was finally in a place where she could work and live in peace. Joyce was grateful for the chance. She worked hard, waking up early every morning to clean every corner of the mansion. She made sure the floors sparkled, the windows were spotless, and the meals were prepared just right. Eric rarely spoke to her, and that was fine by Joyce. She was just happy to have a roof over her head and food to eat. The mansion was grand, but it was also quiet. Eric spent most of his days in his office or out on business trips. He had everything: cars, expensive clothes, and fine art decorating his walls. But inside, he felt empty. He had no family, no real friends. The people around him were snobby and only liked him because he was rich, not because they cared about him. For a whole year, Joyce lived and worked in that big mansion, keeping to herself and doing her best to avoid any trouble. Eric noticed how different she was from the others. She didn't try to impress him or ask for anything extra. She was just there, quietly doing her job. One evening, after a particularly long day, Eric was sitting alone in his grand dining room. The table, long enough to seat 20 people, felt even more empty than usual. As Joyce cleared the dishes, Eric spoke for the first time in months. "Joyce, do you ever get tired of this?" he asked suddenly, his voice softer than usual. Joyce paused, surprised that he was speaking to her. "Tired of what, sir?" she asked carefully. "Of life being the same every day," Eric replied, looking around at his empty house. "Doesn't it get lonely?" Joyce thought for a moment. "I guess it does sometimes. But I've been through worse," she said honestly. "At least here I have a job, a place to stay, and no one to hurt me." Eric was quiet for a moment, thinking about her words. He had never considered what her life might have been like before coming here. He knew nothing about her struggles or the pain she had faced. He only saw her as a maid, someone who worked in his home. But now, hearing her speak, he realized there was more to her than he had thought. As the days went by, Eric found himself noticing Joyce more and more. She was not like the people he was used to, those who only wanted to be around him for his money. Joyce was kind and hardworking, never complaining about the tasks given to her. She reminded him of something he hadn't felt in a long time: honesty. One afternoon, as Joyce was dusting the living room, Eric sat down on the couch and watched her for a while. "You've been here for a year, haven't you?" he asked suddenly. "Yes, sir," Joyce replied, not stopping her work. "You never ask for anything. You don't complain. Why is that?" he asked, curious. Joyce stopped and looked at him. "Because I know what it's like to have nothing, sir," she said simply. "I'm grateful for what I have now." Eric nodded, understanding more about her than ever before. Over time, they began to talk more. It was small at first, simple greetings in the morning or short conversations about the house. But as the weeks passed, their conversations grew longer and deeper. Eric, who had once been cold and distant, started to find comfort in Joyce's presence. She was the only person in his life who didn't treat him like a walking bank account. She didn't flatter him or try to get anything out of him. She was real. One evening, after a long day, Eric and Joyce sat in the kitchen together. Eric had poured himself a drink, and for the first time, he offered Joyce one too. She hesitated but accepted, sitting down across from him. "You're different from everyone I know," Eric said, his voice low. "I don't feel alone when I'm around you." Joyce didn't know what to say. She had never expected to hear such words from a man like Eric. She felt a mix of emotions: surprise, confusion, and something else she couldn't quite place. And then, slowly but surely, their relationship began to shift. What started as small talks became deeper connections, and before they knew it, they found themselves drawn to each other in a way neither had expected. But it was a secret, one they both knew could change everything. Joyce was scared. She had come from nothing, and now she found herself in a situation she never imagined. She wondered if this path could lead to a better life, or was it another twist of fate waiting to bring her down again? Joyce had felt different for weeks, tired, dizzy, and oddly happy. She hadn't been feeling like herself, and when she missed her monthly cycle, she realized the reason. She was pregnant. At first, fear gripped her heart, but as she sat alone in her small room, a quiet joy began to grow inside her. She was going to be a mother. The thought of holding her baby made her smile, and she imagined a life where she, Eric, and their child would live together as a family. Joyce decided to tell Eric the news. She thought he would be happy, maybe even excited. After all, they had shared something special, and now they had a child on the way. She waited until he came home from work one evening. It was quiet in the mansion as usual. Joyce stood in the kitchen, her hands shaking as she thought of the right way to tell him. When Eric finally walked in, looking tired and distracted, Joyce gathered all her courage. "Eric," she called softly. He looked up, frowning slightly. "What is it, Joyce?" "I need to tell you something important," Joyce said, her voice barely above a whisper. Her heart was beating so fast she thought it might leap out of her chest. Eric leaned against the kitchen counter, clearly not in the mood for a serious conversation. "What is it?" "I've had a long day," he said impatiently. Joyce took a deep breath. "I'm pregnant, Eric. We're going to have a baby." For a moment, the room was silent. Eric's face froze as the words hit him. He stared at her, not saying anything. Joyce felt the silence stretch on, her heart sinking as she saw the look on his face. It wasn't happiness or joy. It was panic. "Pregnant?" Eric finally said, his voice cold and distant. "How could you let this happen?" Joyce felt her heart drop. I thought you'd be happy," she said, tears welling up in her eyes. Eric shook his head, his eyes narrowing. Happy? Joyce, do you even understand what this means? I can't have a child with you. What will people think? My reputation, my business, it will all be ruined. Joyce stood there, stunned. But it's our baby, she whispered, her voice trembling. Eric stepped closer, his face hard. No, Joyce, this is your problem now. I can't be involved in this. I can't have this baby ruining my life. Joyce stared at him, unable to believe the words coming out of his mouth. Eric, please, we can raise the child together, she pleaded, tears now streaming down her face. But Eric's expression didn't soften. He looked at her with cold eyes, no longer seeing the woman he had shared so much with. You need to leave, he said flatly. You can't stay here anymore. Joyce gasped. Leave? Where will I go? I have no one, Eric. I thought you cared about me. Eric turned away, his back to her. I can't help you, Joyce. I need you out of my life. Find somewhere else to go. Joyce felt like the ground had been pulled out from under her. The man she had trusted, the man she had thought might love her, was sending her away. Pregnant, heartbroken, and completely alone. She packed her few belongings, her mind numb with disbelief. She had no money, no family, no one to turn to. She felt completely lost as she walked out of the mansion for the last time. The grand house that had once felt like her safe place now felt like a prison she had been set free from, but not in a good way. She felt abandoned and discarded. With the little savings she had left, Joyce took a bus to a small town far away. She didn't care where she went, as long as it was far from Eric and the life she had known. The bus ride was long, and Joyce stared out the window, watching the city fade away into the distance. Her heart ached with every mile, the pain of Eric's betrayal fresh in her mind. When she arrived in the town, everything felt unfamiliar. The people were different, the streets were quieter, and the air was cooler. Joyce found a small, run-down room to rent with the last of her savings. It wasn't much, but it was a roof over her head. Alone in the small room, Joyce sat on the bed, her hands resting on her stomach. She felt a tiny flutter inside her and closed her eyes, tears streaming down her face. I'll protect you, she whispered to her unborn child. I won't let anyone hurt you the way I've been hurt. But deep inside, Joyce knew the road ahead would be hard. She had no one to rely on but herself. She was scared of what the future held, but for the sake of her child, she would keep going. The first few months in the new town were tough for Joyce. Everywhere she went, people whispered behind her back. Some pointed at her belly, and others shook their heads in disapproval. They saw a young woman, pregnant and alone, and judged her without knowing her story. Joyce kept her head down, pretending not to notice the looks or hear the whispers. She was determined to survive, for her baby's sake. She knew she couldn't let their words break her. Every morning, she woke up early and went out looking for work. No job was too small for her. She cleaned houses, mended clothes, and even helped the market women carry heavy loads. Every coin she earned, she saved for her baby. The days were long, and sometimes Joyce felt like giving up. Her back ached from the heavy work, and her heart still hurt from Eric's betrayal. But each time she felt weak, she placed her hand on her growing belly and remembered why she was working so hard. I'll give you a better life, she whispered to her unborn child. You won't ever feel unwanted like I did. One day, while working at the market, an older woman named Mama Akua noticed Joyce's hard work. She had seen Joyce struggling for months but admired her strength. You work too hard, my dear, Mama Akua said kindly one day as Joyce wiped sweat from her forehead. Joyce smiled weakly. I have to, Mama. I need to take care of my baby. Mama Akua nodded, her eyes softening. You're a strong girl. Don't let these people bring you down. I see your heart, and it's a good one. From that day on, Mama Akua treated Joyce like family. She helped Joyce find more work and even gave her extra food from her market stall. Slowly, some of the other townspeople began to warm up to Joyce as well. They saw how hardworking and kind she was, and they started to respect her for it. Months passed, and soon Joyce's baby was ready to come into the world. The night was quiet when she felt the first sharp pain. She was alone in her small room, clutching her stomach in fear. The pain grew stronger, and she knew it was time. With trembling hands, she gathered her things and hurried to Mama Akua's house, hoping she could help. Mama Akua rushed her to the local midwife, and after hours of labor, Joyce gave birth to a healthy baby boy. Tears of relief and joy filled her eyes as she held her son for the first time. He was tiny, with soft brown skin and bright eyes that seemed to look right into her soul. What will you name him? Mama Akua asked gently, sitting beside her. Joyce looked down at her baby and smiled. David, she whispered. His name is David. From that moment, Joyce's life had new meaning. David was her everything. She spent every waking moment caring for him, feeding him, and watching him grow. As the months passed, David became the center of her world. He had her eyes and her smile, and every time he giggled, it made all of Joyce's struggles feel worth it. Even though they had little, Joyce's love for David made their small home feel full. She worked harder than ever, doing whatever she could to provide for her son. There were days when she barely had enough to eat, but she always made sure David was fed. She would go hungry if it meant he could have what he needed. Joyce's determination and love didn't go unnoticed. People in the town began to admire her for the way she raised David. Even those who had once whispered behind her back now spoke kindly to her. They saw how strong she was, and slowly, Joyce earned their respect. As David grew older, he became a lively, curious boy who brought joy wherever he went. He loved playing with the other children in the town, and though they didn't have much, Joyce made sure he was always clean and well-dressed. She would sew his clothes by hand, patching up old fabrics to make them new again. One evening, as Joyce watched David play outside their small home, she felt a deep sense of peace. Her life wasn't easy, but she had her son, and that was all that mattered. "We'll be all right," she whispered to herself, smiling as David ran to her with a flower he had picked. "Here, Mama," David said excitedly, holding the small flower up to her. Joyce knelt down, taking the flower from his tiny hand. "Thank you, David. It's beautiful," she said, hugging him tightly. In that moment, Joyce knew that no matter how difficult life got, she would always have the strength to keep going. She had made a promise to herself and to David, and she would never let him feel the pain of being abandoned. Years flew by, and David grew into a smart and curious boy. Joyce worked hard, taking on many jobs, just to make sure they had food and clothes. Despite her long hours, she always found time to teach David important lessons. "You must work hard, David, but you should also be kind to others," she would tell him as she tucked him in at night. David listened closely to his mother's words. He admired her strength and never complained about the little they had. Joyce's love made their small home warm, and her hard work taught David the value of never giving up. At school, he was always at the top of his class. While other children played, David studied hard, determined to make his mother proud. His teachers often noticed his focus and dedication. "David is special," they would say to Joyce during parent-teacher meetings. "He's smart and works harder than anyone in the class." Joyce beamed with pride each time she heard those words. She couldn't afford fancy school supplies or books, but David never asked for more than she could give. He used old, secondhand textbooks and borrowed pencils from friends, but he never let that stop him from being the best student in his class. She knew her sacrifices were worth it, seeing how far David had come despite the challenges they faced. One day, during David's final year of high school, something unexpected happened. The school principal called him into the office. David's heart raced, wondering if he had done something wrong. "David, I have wonderful news for you," the principal said with a wide smile. "Because of your hard work and excellent grades, you've been chosen for a scholarship. It will cover your university education." David's eyes widened in shock. "A scholarship?" he asked, barely able to believe what he had just heard. "Yes, David," the principal confirmed. "This scholarship will allow you to study in the city at one of the best universities." David couldn't contain his excitement. He ran home after school, bursting through the door. "Mama, Mama, you won't believe what happened," he shouted. Joyce turned from the pot she was stirring, startled by David's excitement. "What is it, David? What's going on?" "I got a scholarship," David exclaimed, his face lit up with joy. "They're sending me to university in the city, and it's all paid for." Joyce stood there in shock, her eyes filling with tears. She dropped the spoon and rushed over to David, wrapping him in a tight hug. "Oh, David, I'm so proud of you," she said, her voice breaking. "You've worked so hard, and now all your efforts have paid off." David held his mother close, feeling the weight of her love and pride. "It's because of you, Mama. You've always been there for me, and I want to make you proud." Joyce wiped her tears and smiled. "You already have, David. You've made me the happiest mother in the world." The days leading up to David's departure were filled with excitement, but also a bit of sadness. Joyce was proud, but the thought of her only son leaving for the big city made her heart ache. She helped him pack his clothes, folding each item with care. "You'll do great, David," Joyce said, trying to hide her tears. "Just remember everything I've taught you. Work hard, be kind, and never forget where you come from." "I won't, Mama," David promised. "I'll make sure to visit as much as I can." Finally, the day came when David had to leave for the city. Joyce and David stood at the bus stop, waiting for the bus that would take him away to his new life. Joyce's hands trembled as she held his. She had always been strong, but now the reality of David leaving felt overwhelming. "Mama, don't worry," David said softly, sensing her anxiety. "I'll come back, and I'll make you even prouder." Joyce forced a smile and nodded, her eyes misty with tears. "I know you will, David. Just promise me you'll take care of yourself." The bus arrived, and David gave his mother one last hug before stepping onto the bus. As the bus pulled away, David waved through the window, watching his mother grow smaller and smaller in the distance. His heart ached to leave her behind, but he knew he was doing the right thing. He had a chance to build a better future for both of them, and he wouldn't let it slip away. Joyce stood there for a long time, watching until the bus disappeared from sight. She wiped away her tears and whispered, "Go and make your dreams come true, David. I'll always be here waiting for you." At university, David thrived. He studied business and economics, always remembering his mother's hard work. His dedication didn't go unnoticed. During an event organized by the university, David met Anthony, a wealthy businessman. Anthony was impressed by David's intelligence and drive. "Tell me, young man, what are your plans after university?" Anthony asked, his eyes studying David with interest. David, slightly nervous but confident, replied, "I want to start my own business and help my mother. She sacrificed so much for me, and I want to give back to her." Anthony smiled and said, "I see great potential in you, David. Let me help guide you. With the right mentorship, you could achieve more than you imagine." From that day, Anthony took David under his wing, helping him find internships and meet important people. David admired Anthony's success and was grateful for his help. Soon, Anthony became more than just a mentor. He became like a father figure to David. During school breaks, David would return home to visit his mother, Joyce. He often spoke about Anthony's support and how much he had helped him. Joyce was thankful for Anthony's kindness and invited him over for dinner whenever David was home. The first time Anthony came to their house, Joyce greeted him with a warm smile. "Thank you for all you've done for David. It means the world to me." Anthony waved her off with a chuckle. "It's nothing, Joyce. David is a fine young man, and it's my pleasure to help him." As time passed, Anthony and Joyce grew closer. They would talk during dinners, and slowly, Anthony began to see more than just the strong, hardworking mother in Joyce. He saw a kind, gentle woman who had given everything for her son. Without even realizing it, Anthony started falling in love with her. One day, David noticed Anthony acting differently around his mother. He could see the way Anthony looked at her with soft eyes and a warm smile. "Anthony, do you have feelings for my mother?" David asked directly, catching Anthony by surprise. Anthony paused for a moment before admitting, "Yes, David, I do. I care deeply for your mother, and I'm serious about her, but I would never do anything without your blessing." David thought for a while. He knew Anthony was a good man, and he wanted his mother to be happy, so he decided to help. "Okay, Anthony, I think my mother deserves happiness too. I'll help you, but you have to treat her well," David said, smiling. Anthony nodded, grateful for David's support. "I promise, David, I'll treat her with all the love and respect she deserves." Over the next few weeks, David began to set up small surprises for his mother and Anthony, encouraging them to spend more time together. He would suggest they go for walks after dinner or sit together while he studied. Slowly, Joyce began to notice. One evening, while washing dishes, Joyce asked her son, "David, why are you trying to get me and Anthony together?" David put down his book and looked at her seriously. "Mama, you've spent so many years taking care of me. You've always put me first, but it's time for you to have your own happiness too. Anthony is a good man, and he cares about you." Joyce sighed, thinking about what David said. Her mind wandered back to Eric, the man who had abandoned her when she needed him most. She had promised herself she would never trust another wealthy man. But then she thought of Anthony, kind, supportive Anthony who had been there for her and David. "I don't know, David. I'm scared. I don't want to get hurt again," Joyce confessed. "I understand, Mama," David said softly. "But Anthony is different. He's been there for us, and he truly cares about you. Just give him a chance." Joyce stayed up that night, thinking about everything. She didn't want to be alone forever, and maybe, just maybe, it was time to open her heart again. The next morning, Joyce made a decision. She would give Anthony a chance. They started dating, slowly at first. Anthony treated Joyce with kindness and love, always making sure she felt valued and respected. He took her on simple dates, like walks in the park and quiet dinners. Joyce began to feel something she hadn't felt in years: happiness. David watched them grow closer, smiling to himself. He was glad his mother had found someone who could make her smile again. As David neared the end of his university studies, he was already working on starting his own small business. It wasn't much at first, but with his determination and Anthony's guidance, it began to grow quickly. Soon, investors started noticing his efforts. With his business expanding, David bought a house in the city. He also moved his mother to the city, where she and Anthony could spend more time together. Life was finally looking bright for both David and Joyce as they prepared for the next chapter in their lives. Eric's life had changed a lot since he sent Joyce away. He had built a thriving business and grown wealthier with every passing year. Along the way, he met Agnes, a woman from the same social status as him. They eventually got engaged. At first, everything seemed perfect, but as Eric spent more time with Agnes, he realized they didn't connect the way he had with Joyce. Agnes is everything I'm supposed to want, Eric told himself. We're from the same world, and that's all that matters. But deep down, Eric knew something was missing. Agnes didn't listen to him like Joyce had. Joyce used to care about him, even though she didn't know much about business. She'd offer advice, comfort, and support whenever he needed it. Agnes, however, was more interested in parties and status. Despite these doubts, Eric pushed forward with his life. But soon, things took a turn for the worse. A series of bad investments left his business struggling, and Eric was desperate. He tried everything to fix the mess, but nothing worked. One evening, Eric sat at his desk, staring at financial reports. His hands trembled as he realized just how bad things were. His once successful empire was about to collapse. He needed help, fast. Agnes will understand, Eric thought, trying to reassure himself. She's my fiancée, after all. But when Eric told Agnes about his problems, her reaction was not what he expected. She looked at him with cold eyes, not a trace of concern in her voice. "We should dissolve our engagement," Agnes said flatly. "I can't be with a man who's about to go bankrupt. I need someone who can maintain my lifestyle." With that, she walked out, leaving Eric stunned. His heart sank. He thought back to Joyce, remembering how she had stood by him during tough times, always offering a shoulder to lean on. He had let her go because of his pride and social status, and now he was all alone. Eric shook his head, refusing to give up. He wasn't going to lose everything. Desperation fueled him as he searched for investors to save his business. One afternoon, as he sat in his office looking through potential partners, his assistant knocked on the door. "Sir, I've found someone you might want to meet," she said, handing him a file. "His name is David Johnson, a young entrepreneur who's been making a lot of noise in the business world. He might be able to help." Eric quickly agreed to a meeting. They arranged to meet at a high-end restaurant. When the day arrived, Eric walked into the restaurant, feeling both nervous and hopeful. As he sat down, something about the young man sitting across from him felt familiar. But Eric brushed the thought aside, focusing on the business. "Thank you for meeting with me, David," Eric began. "I've heard great things about you and your work." David smiled politely. "It's an honor, Mr. Eric. I've worked hard to get where I am, and my mother has been a big part of that." The mention of David's mother caught Eric's attention. Throughout their conversation, David spoke fondly of her. It was clear he loved and respected her deeply. "My mother always told me that no matter what, you have to stay true to yourself," David said. "She's been through a lot, but she never gave up." Eric couldn't help but feel curious. "She sounds like an incredible woman. What's her name?" David smiled again. "Her name is Joyce." Eric's heart skipped a beat. Could it be the same Joyce? He wondered, but he didn't say anything. As they wrapped up the meeting, David's phone rang. He picked it up, his face lighting up. "Hi, Mom," David said, clearly happy. "Oh, you're here at the restaurant too? Great. I'll meet you outside in a few minutes." David turned to Eric. "My mom and her friend are here, but they're in a different room. We'll leave together. You can meet her if you want." Eric nodded, feeling a strange pull to meet this woman. He stood beside David as they waited near the restaurant's entrance. A moment later, David called out, "Mom, over here." Eric turned to see a woman approaching, and his breath caught in his throat. It was Joyce, the woman he had sent away all those years ago. She looked beautiful, more radiant than he remembered, and beside her was a tall, handsome man, smiling warmly. "Eric?" Joyce gasped when she saw him, stopping in her tracks. She couldn't believe it. David looked between them, confused. "Do you two know each other?" Joyce took a deep breath and turned to her son. "David, this man is your father." The words hit David like a truck. "What?" he whispered, stepping back. His eyes darted from Joyce to Eric, and anger flashed across his face. "How could you?" David shouted, glaring at Eric. "How could you just leave us like that?" Joyce reached out for him, but David shook his head and stormed off, leaving both his mother and Eric behind. Joyce quickly followed after him, her heart breaking at the sight of her son in so much pain. Eric stood there, frozen. His past had caught up to him, and now he was left alone once more, confronted by the full weight of his mistakes. David was furious as he drove home. His mind raced with thoughts of his mother, Joyce, and the hardships she had faced raising him alone. He clenched the steering wheel tightly, replaying the shocking moment when he found out that Eric, the man he admired in business, was his father, the same man who had thrown his mother out of his house because she was pregnant. When he reached home, Joyce was waiting for him, her face calm and loving as always. "Mom, how could you not tell me?" David asked, his voice trembling with frustration. "He threw you out. He didn't care about us at all." Joyce sighed and gently placed her hand on David's shoulder. "I know, David, but holding on to anger won't change the past. Look at where we are now. We're happy, and that's all that matters." David paced the room, still unable to shake the anger inside him. "But Mom, he didn't just leave. He made you leave, knowing you were carrying me. You did everything for me, and he never cared." Joyce smiled softly, her eyes filled with warmth. "I won't lie and say it didn't hurt back then, but we made it through, and now I have something to tell you." Her face lit up as she spoke. "Anthony proposed to me, David. We're getting married." David's anger melted away at the news. A wide grin spread across his face. "Mom, that's amazing. I'm so happy for you. Anthony's a great guy and he'll make you really happy." Joyce nodded, her smile growing even brighter. "He already has." But that night, as David lay in bed, he couldn't sleep. His thoughts kept drifting back to Eric. He wondered why Eric had thrown them out, all to protect his reputation. Was there more to the story? Why didn't Eric ever try to find them? The questions weighed heavily on him, and he knew he couldn't just let it go. The next morning, David made up his mind. He wasn't going to let his anger eat him up forever, but he needed answers. He had to know why his father had abandoned them. Without telling his mother, he headed straight to Eric's office. When David arrived at Eric's office, he barged in without knocking. Eric looked up from his desk, startled to see David standing there, his face tight with frustration. "David," Eric began, but David cut him off. "Why?" David demanded, his voice sharp. "Why did you throw my mother out of your house? Why did you abandon her when she was pregnant with me?" Eric felt a knot form in his stomach. He looked at his son, seeing the pain and anger in his eyes. He sighed heavily, guilt weighing down on him. "I was a coward, David," Eric said quietly. "I cared too much about my reputation. I thought more about what people would say about me, a wealthy man who had gotten his maid pregnant, than I did about the woman I loved and the child she was carrying. I threw her out to protect myself, and it's something I regret every single day." David's eyes flashed with resentment. "So you just threw her away like she didn't matter? Like I didn't matter?" Eric hung his head, shame filling his heart. "I was wrong. I was young, and I made a terrible decision. I let my pride and fear of judgment control me. I can't change what I did, but I can ask for your forgiveness." David was silent for a moment, his emotions swirling inside him. He remembered his mother's words, how she had chosen to forgive and move on with her life. He knew deep down that holding on to anger would only hurt him in the end. Taking a deep breath, David looked at Eric. "I can't forget what you did, but I'll give you a chance to make things right. Not for you, but for me." Eric's eyes welled up with tears. "Thank you, David. I'll do whatever it takes to earn your trust." Slowly, David began to let Eric back into his life. They spent time together, talking about the past and building a relationship they had never had before. Eric was grateful for the opportunity to be part of his son's life, even if it had come so late. Meanwhile, Joyce and Anthony's relationship blossomed as they prepared for their wedding. Joyce, being the forgiving person she was, sent a wedding invitation to Eric. When Eric received the invitation, his heart sank. He realized that although Joyce was kind enough to invite him, he had lost his chance to truly be part of her life. The invitation was a reminder of all that he had given up. On the day of the wedding, Joyce looked stunning in her wedding gown, radiating happiness. As she walked down the aisle with Anthony by her side, Eric watched from afar, his heart heavy with regret. He realized that he had lost something precious long ago, and no amount of apologies could change that. But he was grateful to at least be there, witnessing her joy. After the wedding, Joyce and Anthony led a fulfilling life, doing charity work and inspiring young people with their love and dedication. David continued to grow his business, and in time, he found true love as well. He got married and had 2 beautiful children, a boy and a girl. Though Eric had missed his chance with Joyce, he was determined not to miss out on his grandchildren's lives. He became a loving grandfather, making sure to be there for them in ways he hadn't been for David. In the end, Joyce, Anthony, and David lived happily ever after, their lives filled with love, success, and joy. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this story, kindly like this video and subscribe to this channel for more amazing videos.